Okay. Hello, hello. Welcome back, Unstoppable friends. I have such a absolutely special guest today. We have Dr. Kristi Angevine joining us for a very special conversation. I'm going to have her introduce herself in just a moment, but let me just tell you a little sneak peek. We are going to be talking about habits. And I know that habits are something that literally apply to the busiest working mom, to the high achiever at work, with your kids, at home, in your relationships. Habits are something that define the results that we are creating. And having a habits expert like Kristi is going to be really special. So, Kristi, thank you so much for coming today and having this conversation. Tell us all about you and how you got into coaching and habits. Oh, and did I mention that she's an OBGYN? So, there's that too. Go ahead.
Well, I love that introduction so much. And it's just so fun to be here because we just, met about a week ago for a similar conversation.
Yeah.
And I left that conversation eager to continue talking.
Yeah.
But I love that introduction so much because 4, 5, 10 years ago, I would never have envisioned that somebody would have me on their podcast and say, and our habits expert, life
Mm.
coach, and oh, by the way, OBGYN.
Oh, by the way.
Um,
Yeah.
Right. So anyways, I'm Kristi Angevine and I am also an OBGYN and I do, deep dive coaching similar to you. I really love internal family systems informed coaching and I sort of fell into habits coaching simply
Mm.
because I was really interested in repetitive thought patterns and sort
Mm.
of almost just unclear etiologies for the ways we emotionally respond to things
Mm.
and our repetitive behaviors. And my early coaching, I did focus on helping physicians who were
Mm-hmm.
struggling with drinking more than they wanted. And
Okay.
so when I was thinking about, okay, so how do I talk about this in a way that takes away some of the stigma? I started
Mm-hmm.
realizing that talking about the behavioral habits, the mindset habits, those sort of
Mm-hmm.
patterned emotional responses worked
Mm-hmm.
really well for physicians who were
Mm-hmm.
wanting to work on their drinking or their
Mm-hmm.
eating or their scrolling or something that just felt compulsive. And
Yeah.
the more I dove into habits themselves, the more I realized how fascinating it was. Um, so the way I got into coaching is like how many of us did. I heard a podcast. I was on call one
Yeah.
night, waiting for a
Yeah.
baby to deliver,
Yeah.
staring at a strip that was kind of benign
Right.
and thought, what the heck, I'll listen to this podcast.
Yeah.
And I was instantly like,
Yeah.
somebody put their talents in me and were like,
Yeah.
listen, all this
Yeah.
cognitive behavioral coaching stuff, it's
Mm.
amazing. And it wasn't
Mm.
long before that, after listening to that podcast, that I remember very vividly in this current house we're in, being at our island in our kitchen, talking to my
Yeah.
husband, saying, I'm pretty sure I must sign up for a coach certification.
Mm.
It just has to happen. I don't know. I can't explain why this really must happen. And thinking
Mm.
he was going to look at me like I had three heads because
Right.
his background is in critical care
Yeah.
nursing.
Yeah.
Coaching is not anything that
Oh,
is
yeah.
on his radar.
Yeah.
And being absolutely delighted when he said,
Mm.
"If you feel like this about it, you just have to
Mm.
do it." So
Mm.
so that's how I
Oh, yeah.
started, and here I am. And it really, like, that intuition at that moment was like a
Yeah.
moment of clarity for me that has
Right.
stayed stable over the years.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because you're right. Like, if who would have thought a few years ago that you and I, two OBGYNs, would be sitting here having a conversation about coaching and mindset and habits and living a lighter life effectively? Like, who would have thought a few years ago that we would be having this conversation? And it's interesting because what you shared about your husband was kind of similar with me, where I like had that good on paper, everything felt like reasonable and things were fine, but they didn't feel great, if that makes sense. And I stumbled
Mm.
onto this podcast and I told my husband about it, and I was like, so there's this thing that's a coaching thing. And he was like, I don't really understand what this coaching thing is. And I mean, even nowadays, he will sometimes be like, that coaching thing. But he could see that I was so lit up about it and felt that intuitive hit of like, this is something I have to pursue it deeply. And then, like, here we are, a couple of years
Yeah.
later, talking about coaching, which is so amazing.
Right. I would have predicted we would be on here talking about, you
Yeah.
know, trial of labor after C-section or GBS
Yep.
prophylaxis or
Yeah.
hysterectomy
Yeah.
technique. And we
Right.
are not.
No, we are not talking about all of the OBGYN things, which we have loved to talk about before. But now I think we get to talk about impact with habits. So, just, the first question that I have for you is why do you think that habits are so important?
So somebody the other day sent me a quote, and it was, I'm gonna
Yeah.
totally get it wrong, but it was something to the effect that we don't choose our future, but we do choose our habits. And when we choose our
Mm,
habits, then we therefore decide our future. And
mm,
the idea that what we repetitively do,
mm,
subconsciously on default,
mm,
how we repetitively think, even if we don't
mm,
maybe know why, what we naturally believe, even if we haven't questioned it, the idea that that can have far reaching impact to me is just so profound. And so I
mm,
love looking at things that come naturally to us because those
mm.
things that come naturally to us are the things that we habituate, that are our habituated approaches. And so when we
Yeah.
can look at what comes naturally and just sort
Mm,
of look at it and go, oh, it's so interesting that I
mm,
naturally do that, naturally think that, naturally feel that. And when we can look at those and go, okay, so these are the things I love. These are like maybe my
mm,
strengths, my
mm.
natural, inclinations that really serve me.
Yeah.
And these other things that I naturally do on default, maybe they don't serve me so much. When we
Mm.
can look at them from that framework, then I think it's non-pathologizing, but
Right.
it's very easy to look at. I mean, if we could just do an inventory of our lives, we can see
Yeah.
what our habits are just because they're the things we do every day.
When you just said that, the very first thing that came to my mind was this idea that, we look at our habits, like what you were just looking, like describing, and I, I know I've done this, and I'm sure many of my listeners, like we kind of blame ourselves. We catch some habits that maybe we don't like, and we don't look at it objectively. We turn it into a pathology, right? Like we turn it into like something is wrong with us, or I can't believe that I naturally created that habit. How come I did that? How come other people don't have that habit? It's like,
Yeah.
what do you say about that? Because I feel like that is one of the things that held me back, still holds me back from really looking cleanly at the
Yeah.
habits that I have.
So I think that's such a keen question because I
Yeah.
think what you just described so well is a habit in and of itself. The habit
Mm.
of criticizing and then
Oh.
presuming that whatever we're looking at must be a result of some either incompetence, unique
Hmm.
defect,
Yeah.
something wrong with me. And that
Oh.
is a habit in and of itself. And that is
Oh
extremely,
my
I mean, it's,
gosh.
I don't know if it's universal, but I would wager
Yeah.
that it's extremely common,
Mm.
probably comes from really like younger stages in our life where,
Mm.
and my theory on this is that, sort of an amalgamation of every other person's theory on where these things come from is that
Yeah.
something may have occurred, or
Hmm.
many, many somethings may have occurred. And if we didn't have an explanation for why something felt difficult or confusing or unclear, a way to get a little bit of control is to say, well,
Hmm.
this must be because of something I did or something about me. And if
Oh.
something is, something seems really scary or seems really negative, it's maybe a way to say, oh, well, I can't explain this, but if there's something wrong with me that explains why this occurred or explains why things are,
Oh.
then at least I've got a theory or a hypothesis, and maybe I could
Mm.
fix that. So
Mm.
if that little morsel of an idea grows with us through adulthood, then
Mm.
anytime we see something in ourselves that we don't really like, we can
Mm.
conclude, well, it's just because there's something uniquely wrong with me that I stay up too
Oh.
late, or uniquely wrong
Mm.
with me that I keep pressing snooze, or that I ate
Yeah.
the whole, sleeve of Thin Mints, or one of my patients would bring
Right.
me this massive tin of Thin Mints,
Yeah.
that it would go away.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with me. So that idea
Oh.
of judging ourselves for a habit, I think, is so common, and that can
Oh.
be a barrier to the change because we might want to
Oh.
change and think that, okay, well, we must change by either forcing ourselves to change our
Yeah.
behavior using
Right.
willpower or
Right.
strong arming ourselves, or in some way just trying to like criticize ourselves to a change.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. What you're saying right now is just blowing my brain a little bit because I have always thought about habits like, overeating, over drinking, over scrolling as, and the way I've talked about it even on this podcast is it's a habit that we created at some point some years ago because in our brain it served some purpose. Maybe we got to avoid or distract or
Totally.
numb some uncomfortable emotions. That was our best skill set at the time. And here we are now. We're like turning the light switches on and we're like becoming conscious of these habits. But what you're talking about here is the barrier that sometimes gets in the way of us addressing those habits. So
Mhm.
I think that that is so important to just spend a little bit of time on when we think about that habit. So we maybe as a young child, we saw the world, we saw something either scary or difficult, and we created a story about it in our mind. The best way to explain the story was we made it about us. Something was missing, we did something wrong, and now we've grown up with that. So it's a little hardwired maybe in our subconscious brain.
Yeah.
How do we just start to recognize that this barrier is there? How do we just start to kind of ease on the barrier so we can address these habits that we really, really want to solve?
Yeah. So I think we share this. We both
Yeah.
really love concepts and tools and ideas. And at the
Yeah.
same time, we really like to keep things practical. And it's sort of like a
Yes.
hallmark of an OBGYN. Like, yes, there's
Exactly.
theory, and yet we have to act. So when it
Absolutely. Yeah.
comes to like getting really realistic about this, I think it always comes down to awareness. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the first steps, because not everybody does this, has this habit of
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
having this critical barrier. But for those of
Yeah.
us who do, the best
Mm-hmm.
way to do this is to bring up any habit you have that you've been
Mm.
trying to change.
Yeah.
Anyone. So your listeners can just be thinking, okay, what's some habit that I've been working on for a long time, I've struggled to have sustainable change with?
Yeah.
And then just without overthinking it, just go, okay, how do I feel about the fact that I have this habit? And if
Mm.
the way you feel is some form
Uh,
of
yeah. Yeah.
discouragement
Yeah.
or defeat, or there's something wrong with me, or
Mm-hmm.
guilt, or anything that's not like something more neutral to positive, you
Yeah.
could guess that perhaps the story that you're carrying with you is one that's
Yeah.
more critical. Like, what's wrong with
Yeah.
me that I do this? Because as
Right.
soon as somebody says that to me
Mm-hmm.
externally, what is
Yeah.
wrong with you that you did this? If I really take
Right.
that to heart, I will probably feel some version of discouraged. But if I do it to
Yeah.
myself, I'll feel the same thing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that as just like such a practical way to take inventory and assess whether we have this as a barrier. And maybe not everybody does, but I would just be willing to guess that many listeners who are high achieving, working moms, women, humans in general, probably have some flavor of this because it is just been there for decades. And I love that. So when we, let's say we, but do you recommend when we imagine looking at habits, when we, let's say, think about the habit of what I wanted to talk about today was overthinking and ruminating and dwelling, but you could probably plug in any habit: overeating, over drinking, over
Absolutely.
scrolling,
Yeah.
overworking is a habit. So if we think about any of those overing habits and we uncover this barrier, do you think it's possible to make sustainable change in both at the same time? Or is it important to really address this barrier first before you move on to really looking at the habits you want to change?
Yeah. So, well, the caveat here is that everybody has their own unique way. There's
Yeah.
not a one size fits all. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that you can address the habit in a sustainable way if you
Mm.
don't either prior to address the judgment or at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. I think concurrent is
Yeah.
totally fine. You say,
Yeah.
oh, I noticed that I'm judging myself for over scrolling.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I have that going on, and I'm curious why I do that, and I'm curious why
Mm-hmm.
I over scroll. You could do them
Right.
simultaneously, but I don't
Right.
think you can leave out the part
Mm.
that judges. Because
Yeah.
in that, I think when we leave that part out, we're
Yeah.
presuming that once we fix the habit, we'll stop judging ourselves. And then what we
Yeah.
do is we stop, let's say over scrolling, but
Right.
that judgment part is just so hardwired, to use that analogy,
Yeah.
that it
Yeah.
will just continue. It will just find something else to judge us about.
Right.
Well, now we're just late
Right.
all the time, and now we didn't wear the nicest outfit, and now we said something dumb, and now
Mm.
it'll just find another thing to criticize.
Oh, okay. So I think like when I really imagine what you're talking about, it's because I, as you we've talked about before, prior to even recording and even last week on your podcast, the idea that we like to have, I know I do, systems and processes. I like to have
Oh, yes,
strategy. I like to have stepwise.
absolutely.
And I know that I think a lot, and I know I felt like this even when I first discovered coaching. Like, okay, that sounds really good. The theory of what you're talking about sounds really good, but like, what's step one, and then step two, and then step three? And I think this
Yes.
is like the
Hmm.
physician in us. Like, we're used to protocols and algorithms.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about, and tell me if this is true, is almost like giving ourselves permission to zoom out and be flexible to like massage this. Like let both things happen at the same time without there
Hmm.
needing to be like a set step one, step two, step three.
Yeah, so I think that's
Yeah.
a really great point because for those of us who really do like, give me all the steps and give me the how, it can
Yeah.
feel disconcerting to say,
Yeah.
well, you can just kind of step back and just
Yeah.
notice and bring some awareness to these things that might sound
Right.
like really uncomfortable and also
Yeah.
highly impractical.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I do think that as we age, we can do interesting things that are in
Mm.
maybe contrast to each other at the same
Mm.
time. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that you can't have a structure for
Yeah.
systematically looking at the judgment and systematically looking at a habit and
Mm-hmm.
investigating why they're there and then going on to change them. But it does suggest that, and I think this is super important that you brought it up, that if you have a foundation that's built
Mm-hmm.
on some kindness, some compassion, and a
Mm-hmm.
willingness to sort of give yourself the space to do something
Mm-hmm.
that, we're going to be really clear about coaching. It is
Mm-hmm.
not do step A and then
Right.
part one and two and then move to step B.
Right.
Coaching is extremely nuanced. And so
Yes.
having a sturdy foundation from which to start that
Mm-hmm.
allows some flexibility and allows you to
Mm-hmm.
individualize the scaffolding or the organized system approach, I
Right.
think is key because we
Right.
try to do the stepwise approach. That's what we do
Yeah.
when we Google, how do I
Yeah.
stop overthinking? By
Yeah.
every step, when you do how to
Yeah.
stop overthinking, we see the 4 steps, we try to do them and we wonder why maybe it
Exactly.
doesn't work.
Right.
That's
And
when
I
we
think that
box
this is the
ourselves in.
difference, and this is what's so brilliant about the work that you're doing. It's like, we can read every textbook or every, and there are some amazing resources for habits and mindset work, but I think that there's one thing to read a book about it or listen to a podcast like this one. This is where we just get to spark our interest. And then there's another thing to actually live and get coached through it and implement it in real life. And I think
Mhm.
that the stepwise approach with a book, which I have tried, I have looked at lots of habit books and thought about habit changes. It 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 doesn't help me see clearly my own brain. And I think that that's what coaching and being in a coaching community
Yes.
really unlocks. And I think we talked about this last time. It lets us skyrocket results when we put ourselves in coaching containers like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the first image that comes to my mind is somebody who is trying to, get better at their swim technique.
Mm-hmm.
Often, I mean, it's really common for people to take a video of themselves swimming at the underwater, the above
Yeah.
water, or to just bring in a swim coach because
Yeah.
that person can actually see what they're doing and can
Yeah.
say, hey, do you realize that, like, when your hands coming out of the water, you're not pushing with your wrist or you're
Mm.
not doing this. And if you tweak this, you would just be
Yeah.
so much more efficient. It's hard
Yeah.
to see it yourself when you're in the pool, like swimming through the
Right.
water to know,
Right.
oh, I hold my
Right.
left shoulder up about half an inch. But
Right.
somebody else can see it so much better and give you
Yeah.
just more perspective more quickly. So it's
Yeah.
not to say that you
Yeah.
can't do it yourself. If the
Yeah.
apocalypse happened and you're the only person
Right.
in a pool and you just want to get
Right.
better, you can totally
Right.
do it, right?
Right. Right.
But sometimes it is just more efficient to have
Yeah.
just outside perspective.
Yeah. And the one thing that just came up when you said that was I think having a coach, we've overcome that first barrier. When you're
Hmm.
evaluating and really looking at your habits of overthinking, ruminating, overeating, over scrolling, when you have a coach that's helping you see and understand those habits and your mindset, they're coming in with a clean, very open, loving perspective. There is no barrier of judgment. So then we get to coach on, I think, the habit right away as you uncover the judgments for yourself. Like what have been my barriers to evaluate this? Oh, I've been judging myself. I think that the coach kind of helps to overcome that piece. What do you think?
100%, because I think we
Yeah.
can, like you and I, and
Mm-hmm.
a coach who's coaching me, we can and they can and me detect that judgment so much easier
Right.
because for me, my
Yeah.
self-judgment is just it's a part of breathing. It's been with me for a
Yeah.
long time. I don't
Mm.
pick up on it because it's really
Mm.
subtle. When it's really
Yeah.
overt, I pick up on it.
Yeah.
And I've been doing
Yeah.
this for a long time and I still
Right.
miss it. I will not
Yes.
catch
Mm-hmm.
little tiny digs at myself.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the way that a coach in helping somebody with habits
Yeah.
can sort of, do the rocket fuel approach because the habit
Mm-hmm.
change to the habit itself can be
Mm-hmm.
so much easier and so much just
Mm-hmm.
takes so much less effort when you're
Oh
not
yeah.
making yourself wrong the entire way. So if you can say, oh,
Right.
wow, you're being really harsh on yourself about this habit, address
Right.
that, then the habit change
Yeah.
itself is, it's just so much simpler, which might
Yeah.
sound crazy to a listener who's like, ah, you're telling me if
Right.
I stop judging myself, it'll be simpler to change my habit of being on
Yeah.
my phone late at night. I
Yeah.
am absolutely saying that.
I love that you're saying that because I think the argument here is wait a second, but if I didn't judge myself, then I would just go to lazy and I would just like not care. It's like
Right.
if I'm not judging myself, I'm
Yeah.
just going to be apathetic and scroll my
Yeah.
phone anyway. So the judgment
Right.
is
And
like
that's
how
not,
I,
yeah.
yeah. Go
Well,
ahead.
and sorry to cut you off, but I was just thinking, I mean, what you said is
Yeah.
so important for people to hear
Hmm.
because the reason why we do that, we connect judgment with high quality performance,
Yeah.
or and if I remove the judgment, I'm
Hmm.
going to be mediocre or lazy or bad or something.
Mm.
The reason we did that is because that served a purpose at some point in time.
Yeah.
Some point in time, being a bit
Hmm.
critical, being a bit harsh, being a little bit like, okay, listen, gotta go, was probably
Yeah.
really useful and
Yeah.
really beneficial.
Yeah.
And the part of us that does that has a good intent. And that good
Hmm.
intent just may not serve us anymore. But
Hmm.
we have connected when I'm harsh, then things turn out well. And
Hmm.
that may have been really literally true at one point in time. It's just
Hmm.
not serving you anymore. So it's like a pair of old
Right.
jeans that you're like,
Right.
these were great back in 1995, but now
Right. Right.
I could wear them, but maybe I
Yeah.
don't love wearing them.
Yeah. And it also kind of reminds me a little bit of I don't know if you ever watched the movie Sliding Doors, where it's this movie that talks about this woman where in they show her two lives. One is when she makes this train and one is when she doesn't make this train. And they show what her two lives end up being just from making the train or not making the train. And the reason I brought this up is it kind of makes me think about we think that our judgment or that criticism, that habit of it is creating some big results because high achievers have a lot of gold stars under their belt. They have a lot of accomplishments, so they think it's been helpful. We have no idea what high achievements, what gold stars you would have also accumulated if you didn't have the judgment. That's just
Yeah.
sliding doors. We don't know what would the other life have been like. We just don't know.
I love how you put I can't
Yeah.
say it any better than that. It's
Yeah.
just, what if you achieved those things
Yeah.
despite that high judgment being there?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what would it be like if it weren't?
Yeah. I just think it's fun to play with that. But what I would kind of love to just take a pivot in a conversation to really think about one specific habit. I when I think about working moms who are really just like ninjas at work, they are shuttling their kids around, they're thinking about meal prepping and then the laundry and then maybe next year's vacation and also like reminding their partners to make sure that they take out the trash. Like I when I think about high achieving ambitious working moms, they are ninjas and rock stars and also I feel because I'm going to put myself into the category we find ourselves thinking a lot about our life. And I
Mhm.
would love to just kind of have a conversation about the difference between thinking and mindset, like really exploring our thoughts, versus overthinking and rumination and dwelling and maybe a flavor of worrying. How do we
Mhm.
distinguish the two?
Yeah, so I think we distinguish the two based on how they feel. You can look at the
Mm,
strict definition of rumination, which is
mm-hmm,
to have deep thought about something. You can
mm,
ruminate about something in a way that's positive,
mm,
or you can, when you think about veterinary medicine, in
mm-hmm,
cows
mm-hmm,
who have their is it the rumen or something where they
mm-hmm.
chew and then they swallow and then it comes back up and they re-chew. And
Okay, yeah.
rumination that has sort of the negative connotations to it that we think about wanting to stop
Yeah.
is usually the type where we are almost compulsively can't stop
Yeah.
this revisiting of something over and over and over and over. Not in
Yeah.
a, wow, this is so interesting. Look at this beautiful
No.
picture of my family. I wonder what so and so is thinking. This is great. And you
Hmm.
could officially qualify that as like I'm ruminating about all these amazing things. But the
Yeah.
rumination that really plagues us is the one where we are
Yeah.
being compulsively drawn, excuse me, to revisit something over and over and over.
Yeah. I like
And
the
it feel, and sorry, and
example.
I should say,
Yeah.
and it,
Yeah.
you can tell you're doing it based on how you feel when you're doing it. There's something
Right.
either heavy or tight, or like I
Yes.
can't stop myself from doing it, but I wish I
Yeah.
could,
Yeah.
as opposed to just being thoughtful and being,
Hmm.
comprehensive and being detail oriented and being just, curious. Those feel
Mm.
totally different.
Yeah. I would say that when I think about, because I would say that the most recent example for me has been doing a lot of rumination from a heavy place. So it's not the good kind, Kristi. It's not the happy kind of looking at the family photo. It was really thinking a lot about my son starting second grade in a new school, new kids, like the whole new thing. And he definitely had a lot of big feelings with the transition. And I found myself really thinking a lot and anticipating and worrying about tomorrow and then thinking about, wait, how did he do last year? And it's almost like revisiting that process again and again and again to the point where I felt kind of stuck in it. And I wonder whether,
Mhm.
and I think that we can plug in anyone that thinks about a problem that they have and they're revisiting it again and again, and they almost can't get out of that cycle. And I'm going to add that we stay then in indecision, or we make a decision that we like come back to it again and again and again. So
Yeah.
what do you say about, like, you catch yourself doing this, you become aware of the habit, like it feels heavy, it's fatiguing, it's like I'm so done thinking about this. How do we stop doing it?
Yeah. So
Tell me.
I think, I mean, one of the things that I really just want to emphasize that you just pointed out is that when we're doing the rumination that we may want to
Mm-hmm.
change, it's oftentimes it's coming from an emotion
Mm-hmm.
that has a heavy or unpleasant
Mm-hmm.
quality to it. And
Mm-hmm.
not that
Mm-hmm.
we need to fix anything that comes from an unpleasant emotion, but this is how you can distinguish it from just being thoughtful or being
Right.
contemplative.
Right.
Um, the interesting thing about rumination is, and I think your listeners are familiar with, the idea that the way we think, it sort of
Yeah.
invokes how we feel, our feelings sort of shape our behaviors. But
Yeah.
rumination is not only repetitive thoughts, because we're repetitively thinking, but it's
Yeah.
also a behavior that comes
Right.
from feelings and comes from a certain thought. And then because
Right.
it's thoughts, it churns more feelings. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what can make us feel stuck, is we get in this rumination
Yeah.
rumination loop, and we're like the person digging the hole with the shovel, and we
Right.
don't know what else to do but keep on digging.
Right.
um,
Right.
so in terms of how we address it and actually change it, I think there's some key things. Number one, for this type of habit, it's not one that usually is amenable to just saying, just stop.
Yeah.
Just directing our
Just
brain to
stop
be like, no,
ruminating.
just stop it,
Stop
stop
thinking.
ruminating.
Stop
That
worrying.
usually doesn't work. Now, if
Yeah.
that does, like
Yeah.
if doing a grounding exercise and using some humor helped,
Mm-hmm.
amazing. There's probably,
Right.
I don't know, what, 5% of rumination that can stop like that. Beautiful pivot.
Sure.
For
Yeah.
the rest of it, it
Mm-hmm.
requires a different approach. And that different approach means that we have to actually understand why we're ruminating
Mm.
before we can change it. And that actually takes a little
Mm.
bit of time. So I think
Mm.
it's really nice for those of us who ruminate. We like to think
Yeah.
about things, we like to investigate things, so we can play
Yeah.
on the strength that's hidden in a rumination cycle
Right.
to do that.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I don't want I don't want to go on if you want to like stick with this
Yeah.
for a second, but I do think there's
Yeah.
a like what comes to mind as I think about rumination is I think
Yeah.
there's a paradigm that's useful to keep in mind as you look at
Yeah.
it
Yes.
that
Yeah.
I would be happy to offer. Now seems like a
Yes.
good time.
Tell me
Okay.
everything. Yeah.
So the sort of paradigm that I use for looking at rumination draws on internal family system. Now,
Mm-hmm.
internal family systems is a unique model in and of itself, and for people
Mm-hmm.
who are familiar with it, this will
Yeah.
ring true. But for people who maybe aren't, internal family systems basically posit that we all have lots of parts, and it's a psychotherapy model that Dr. Richard
Mm-hmm.
Schwartz developed, and basically it says we're all made of parts. Like I
Yeah.
had a part of me that was so excited to talk to you this morning.
Oh,
I also
yeah.
had a part of me that did not want to get out of bed.
Yeah.
I have a part of me that wants to go exercise and a part of me
Hmm.
that thinks that exercising is really dumb.
Yeah.
And I have a part of me that really worries what people think about me. And I also have another part of me that just doesn't care.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when we think about how we have all these different parts of ourselves, then
Mm-hmm.
when we use that lens of internal family systems or IFS, they see every person as a multiplicity. Like
Mm.
we're all of us are made up of all of these different sort of
Mm.
sub personalities or sub
Mm-hmm.
entities, just like that movie, that children's film feature Inside Out,
Oh,
where
yeah.
they're the little characters inside.
Right.
So
Right.
like Derek Scott puts it really nicely. He says we're a habitat. So we have this, and
Mm.
like an ecosystem, all of these different parts have valuable roles they play. But the thing
Mm.
with habits like rumination is that sometimes the parts of us that have a valuable role to play get sort of forced out of their naturally valuable role into doing another role that may not
Oh,
serve us. And I think when we look at
yeah.
like our habits like rumination like that, then we can see that it may have started out as like
Mm.
something really helpful with positive intent,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
over time morphed into
Yeah.
something for whatever reason. And so, like, the
Yeah.
part of us that ruminates may be naturally very good at being very thoughtful, very detail oriented, really creative, can imagine what
Yeah.
things might be like in the future, can look
Yeah.
back at the past and go, oh, that's why that happened.
Mm.
And for some reason, that part of us that does that may have developed a learned response or an
Mm-hmm.
adaptive or coping mechanism to ruminate in the way that we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about it. And the
Yeah.
way IFS would look at rumination is essentially like there's a part of us that has a really good reason to ruminate.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
it may have been protective or adaptive, but it's not
Mm.
serving us now. And when we look
Yeah.
at it like that, that's when we come at it with this like the judgment falls away when we
Oh,
say,
yeah.
if there's a part of me that likes to ruminate and
Yeah.
does it for good reason, but doesn't
Mm-hmm.
realize that like it's actually not serving my whole system right now.
Mm-hmm.
How could I figure out why that came to be and
Mm.
what else might I do with this energy to
Mm.
think and, create
Yeah.
scenarios in my mind?
Oh, yeah.
And in that way, that's where we can naturally sort of almost instead of like trying to block the judgment, be like, I'm going to
Yeah.
stop judging myself. We say,
Yeah.
oh, wow,
Yeah.
I can maybe change my compulsive rumination with this different approach.
Yeah. Oh, I just loved. I literally imagined when you said the word ecosystem, I just imagined each of us have this ecosystem in our bodies, and rumination or overthinking or worrying, any behavior. I think of all of these as behaviors. It's just like in a, not in its optimal habitat. It's like, the rainforest
Yes.
creature sitting in the desert, and like maybe we should just take it back to the rainforest
And you
where,
wonder why it's focusing on trying to get
uh,
water all the time. It's like,
of
that's just,
course.
it wouldn't be
uh
focused on that in the jungle or the rainforest.
right.
But in
Yeah.
this particular set of circumstances,
Yeah.
well, it's just doing the best it can.
Yeah, and it's like no wonder it's trying to get our attention. I also really think about, especially with something like rumination, I think, what you said was so true. When I think about for myself and for my clients and for my audience, this idea that we ruminate or overthink or worry, it's because I deeply care about something. That's all it is.
Absolutely.
I was just talking about this with my client this week. When we worry about our kids or really think about them a lot, it's because we care. That's
Yeah.
really all it is. So that's like imagining rumination in its jungle rainforest habitat. We just love and care about them so much. And, I can imagine how that behavior has just taken a little detour now sitting in the desert, thinking that
Mhm.
if I just, and this is probably like the thought that drives the heaviness and the behavior of rumination, is like, if I just figured out the perfect, best, most right solution, then my thirst would get quenched, right?
Exactly.
For sitting in the
Mhm.
desert, then I wouldn't feel this heaviness. If I just figured out the best thing for my kid, or the best thing for my weight loss, or the best thing for my patient at the hospital, then I don't have to feel this way. And it seems
Exactly.
so productive to think I'm just looking for the absolute best, most perfect decision here. No wonder we keep doing it. It's just like
Mhm.
trying to find that best, most perfect way. And what we're talking about is that's not how we get to feel better. That's not how we
Mhm.
get to quench our thirst.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think what you
Yeah.
pointed out when you described like that there like there's a part of you that cares
Mm.
deeply about your kid. And this part,
Yeah.
to this part, it makes sense to
Mm.
worry, to think, to anticipate.
Mm.
And if we just try to shut the door on that,
Yeah.
then we can basically block some of the beautiful qualities of that aspect
Right.
of us.
Right.
But if we can be like, okay, what if I were just to sort of speak with this part of me like I'm speaking
Yeah.
to another person and
Yeah.
get to know why it thinks it's important to
Right.
anticipate? And like what you
Mm-hmm.
said, you already sort of parsed this out, but that
Yeah.
part might say something like, well, if, there must be a perfect way and it's my job to
Yeah.
find it. And if we were to hear
Yeah.
that from that part of us and
Oh,
go, oh my gosh, wow, you worked
I
so
know.
hard. You're trying to find the
So
perfect way. That
hard.
sounds
Oh,
exhausting.
I know.
And then
Yeah.
inquire like
Mm-hmm.
what that part is, what else
Mm-hmm.
is it worried about? What else
Yeah.
might it need us to know?
Yeah.
And when we do that, then we peel back
Mm.
all the layers and find, maybe a kernel of, I
Yeah.
just love my kid. I'll do anything for them. Okay,
Yeah.
beautiful. But if there was
Yeah.
another way to go about
Yeah.
loving and
Mm-hmm.
preparing your kid in the best way possible, would you be interested?
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. How could we do this together?
Yeah.
That doesn't call on us to ruminate.
Yeah.
And then you're
Yeah.
collaborating and, sort of partnering with your system instead of being
Right.
like, what the hell's your problem for ruminating?
Right. Or like just figure this out already. Or like
Yes,
let's put it on
exactly.
the I mean, I'm a big calendar person and I had like the colored highlighters and schedules. I'm like, let's just put on the calendar. Okay? Like we have 1 hour to make this decision and like it's like trying to force myself. And I think that that does work sometimes to give ourselves constrained amount of times to say I'm going to research for an hour, I'm going to make my best decision. It feels very different to do it like that rather than
Mhm.
trying to like physically. It's like I imagine me like kicking, like grabbing that little character in the desert and like kicking and screaming trying to pull them to water, instead of doing that being like, okay, we're going to research for an hour, we're going to make a decision in the next hour, and then we're going to just love our decision.
Yeah. So different than,
Yeah.
I mean, I what came to mind when I'm picturing your little like, this poor like
Little
rainforest
character.
creature that's in the desert would be
Yeah. Oh.
the difference between what you said and what we oftentimes do with
Mm-hmm.
ourselves with trying to make a change or to stop something would be to
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, in contrast to what you said, in 1 hour, you are
Yeah.
going to make a decision and you are
Yeah.
going to hurry up about it and you are going to come over here and you're going to do this now. Sort of like
Yeah.
scolding a kid from
Yeah.
a place of frustration and irritation, as
Yeah.
opposed to, hey, I get this is hard. You've been in the
Yeah.
desert for a long time. You're just
Yeah.
doing your best. And
Yeah.
also, let's
Yeah.
make a decision
Mm-hmm.
and let's see what happens and love
Mm.
it either way, knowing that we're going to figure it out. And like, we're going to get back to
Yeah.
the rainforest. Okay. Like, it's going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
There's such a different, like a different energy that we're approaching ourselves with when we do it
Yeah.
from that faith.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's two things that you said that I think are piquing my curiosity. One is it is so fatiguing to stay in the worry and to stay in the overthinking and the rumination and the dwelling.
Yeah.
Yet we have been thinking it's productive, but it's like no wonder whenever I think, and this is something that has come up for so many of my clients, like they want to lose weight, but what they want more than the weight loss is to stop thinking about the weight loss. They want to
Yeah.
just solve this problem once and for all because
Mm.
it is exhausting to keep ruminating about it, to not have this problem
Yeah.
solved. And I think that I'm wondering sometimes if that can be for us incentive enough that what we're talking about,
Mm.
how coaching and partnering with those parts of us that we just haven't done, what if that could really solve this exhaustion problem? What do you think?
Yeah, I think sometimes it sounds like, the word I've heard used before is being a merchant of hope. When
Mm-hmm.
you phrase it like that and say,
Mm-hmm.
hey, like, what if we could have the
Mm.
experience of it being less exhaustive,
Yeah.
and yet we could get the same goals?
Yeah.
How would that be? And that's sort of, it's not forcing us to rush towards something better, but it's saying, hey,
Mm-hmm.
it's possible. There's a different way to go about this. And so I think
Yeah.
sometimes that is super soothing. And that
Yeah.
right there can be the motivation of like, oh, you mean there's a
Yeah.
different way that's not so exhausting? and I don't
Yeah.
stay in indecision, I don't stay stuck,
Yeah.
but I can still get what I'm really after, like
Mm-hmm.
freedom from overthinking. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm up for that. What might that look like? And then I think
Yeah.
once we open up that sort of sense of possibility, then we're tapping
Right.
into just a totally different, you know, a different belief in our
Yeah.
capacity for change.
Yeah. Like the little creature can get back to the rainforest and like imagine what our ecosystem would feel like in our bodies.
Mhm.
Imagine, and this is, I think, a lot of what I love to talk about with my audience. Imagine what we could then accomplish. We want to go, listen, I want to get every gold star and A plus still. I love it. I love it. I don't ever want to stop because it's fun and I want to. And imagine how we might get to show up with our work in our life on the scale with our kids in our relationship if all of those parts of us are in the ecosystems that they want to be in. If we felt like we were thriving in ourselves, how might we show up a little bit more leveled up because we are not fighting with those parts of us anymore? Like, how much more energy, time, and bandwidth would we have for all of these things that matter?
I mean, I mean, I guess, excuse me, I just couldn't have said it better because
Yeah.
then we're not like upset with the
Mm.
creature that
Mm-hmm.
thrives in the humidity
Yeah,
for how it's functioning in the desert.
that's right.
So, because, and
Yeah.
when we are open to that possibility, and that might be a hard sell for some of the
Yeah,
listeners to think, okay, something that's
absolutely.
possible for me, I can have like, I can
Yeah.
appreciate that all of these aspects of me have value and have purpose, and I just need to figure out what they are and sort of
Yeah.
get my habitat balanced. And again,
Mm-hmm.
I want to be very firm and say, yes, it's 100% possible for all humans because
Absolutely.
it's sort of our natural
Mm-hmm.
state that
Yep.
I think we started out in.
That's
I
right.
think it's clear to say we
Yeah.
were born with all sorts of valuable, attributes, and
Yeah.
some of them just with, socialization, with our
Yep.
experience with our family of origin or with our
Mm-hmm.
job, they
Yeah.
just morph into different, the
Yeah.
habitat changes around our
Yeah.
system, and it may be
Right.
harder. And we may not have felt
Yeah.
that possibility for a long time, but it really is
Mm-hmm.
accessible.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting, and this kind of speaks to the second point that you had made, was like, let's just see, right? So like you feel that hope, you feel that possibility kind of like resonating in your body, like, okay, I can see how this might be possible for me.
Yep.
I want to just say it requires just trying and letting it be imperfect. And that is, I think, a hard
Yes.
sell for a lot of us who are so wanting the strategy, the step one, two, three, the perfect way. But I think even that is in itself like the path forward. Like allowing it to be imperfect is to me, I think that that's one of the hardest sells.
Yeah, it really is. And I
Yeah.
think in that way, I think it's sometimes easier and safer to
Mm.
do like a retrospective analysis where you look back at things that
Yeah.
you did do imperfectly and
Yeah.
you on purpose try to find times where things weren't perfect, but it did turn out okay. So then you don't have to
Yeah.
go out and like on purpose do something imperfect and then wait for, the other shoe to fall. You could
Right,
look back
right.
and be like, oh, well, that one time that I
Yeah.
did this, it did turn out okay.
Yeah.
Or you can, basically practice something really tiny and benign. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what if
Yeah.
I, took what, Priyanka is saying seriously and
Yeah.
I did something imperfectly and
Mm.
knowing that like even if it's imperfect, it's actually going to be fine. Everybody's going to be
Yeah.
safe. Nothing bad's going to happen. There's going to be no
Yeah.
long lasting repercussions. But what would it be like? And then being
Yeah.
open to trying that in tiny,
Right.
benign ways can sometimes give
Right.
us the confidence to be like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe it's possible elsewhere.
Yeah. And I want to just normalize that for any high achieving working mom, any physician, especially that's listening to this. Imperfection has not been rewarded in our line of work and in our trajectory. Like imperfection had ramifications with your patients, and how they do. So I want to just remind everyone that's listening that there's a reason that we have not wanted or avoided imperfection. It's because it had some serious consequences potentially. And also at the same time, we don't have to apply the paradigm of being the quote unquote perfect doctor or clinician or high achieving worker to how we treat ourselves and our personal journeys. And they can be totally separate at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's so
Yeah.
great that you brought that up because I can imagine somebody driving who's like,
Yeah.
listen, if I hadn't performed at a certain level in that surgery, somebody might
Right.
die,
Yeah.
something harm could happen.
That's right.
And you're saying just to be kind of imperfect. So we're not
Right.
suggesting be cavalier and to be
That's
casual
right.
or to be
Yeah.
sloppy.
Yeah.
We're just thinking, basically positing the possibility
Yeah.
that when it comes to self reflection and looking at habits,
Yeah.
having such a stringent, rigid approach actually doesn't
Yeah.
serve us.
Yeah. It actually kind of speaks back to like the idea of being judgmental versus apathy. It's kind of like a
Mm-hmm.
similar, we're not saying that we're going to be flippant. We can care deeply. It's like, with my like rumination about my son, like I can care deeply and love him and want the best for him and at the same time also know that and not be flippant about it. And at the same time know that my best might be imperfect. Like the decisions that I make with him, or the conversations that I have with him, or the way that we make a decision might be imperfect. It's not flippant to allow for both of those things to be true. I think that that's kind of like the nugget that I'm taking away from what you're saying.
Yeah. Oh, and I think
Yeah.
flippant is a perfect word to use for this context.
Yeah. Christy, I have just absolutely loved this conversation. And this is part two, guys. In case I didn't say this at the beginning, which I will in the intro, but this is part two of our conversation. We had a whole other conversation over on Christy's podcast, Habits on Purpose. So you have to go check out her podcast. And Christy, how can people learn more about you, learn more about the work you do, and start uncovering their habits with you?
Yeah. So despite the fact that I'm really good at overcomplicating many things, or at least had
Yeah.
that habit as a strong habit in my past life,
Yeah.
I like to keep things with my business very simple. But everything is
Yeah.
called habits on purpose. It's
Yeah.
habitsonpurpose.com.
Mm.
I have a Facebook group called Habits on Purpose. My podcast is called Habits on Purpose. Any of those places, they can find me.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to probably have to have parts three, four, five at some point on our podcast. But this was
Yes.
so fun. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And I do want to just take a moment to say that I really do think that the way that you structure talking about these topics really reveals to me the service that you're in, the value that you're giving to your clients and listeners. And so I want all of my listeners to follow you and listen and learn from you, because I think just
Mm,
the way that you're thinking about things is just, it's just so useful. So it was really fun to be on here.
this
And
is so
I
fun.
love that we get to do this again, because I just know that
So
will
do.
happen. And I had such a good time.
I love it. Thanks, Christy.